Welcome to Insights, a Canadian Journal of Political Science podcast. I'm your host, Liddell Hastings, with technical support from Abel Amba. Today we are joined by Florence Dubois to discuss the topic of Parliamentary Debates in Canada, with the article of the same name, covering the years 1901 to 2015. Insights by CJPS can be found on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. To keep up to date on CJPS podcasts, follow us on Twitter at CJPS_RCSP. Thank you for listening. All right, I'm joined today by Florence. Florence, can you introduce yourself and the relevant work before talking about the article at hand today?
Yes, I recently completed my PhD in political science at Université de Montréal. My thesis studied representation in the context of population aging in Canada. So specifically the links between an aging population and representation in Parliament. So my work as a PhD student included an analysis of parliamentary speeches in Canada. So I looked at topics discussed by MPs and the association between topics and the composition of MPs' district. So I was specifically interested in whether MPs who represent larger senior populations, larger unemployed populations, and larger immigrant populations were more likely to discuss issues that are related to seniors, unemployment, and immigration in their speeches in the House. And so I started using parliamentary speech data a lot in my thesis. And so it opened the door to several possible projects, including the one that we're talking about today. So with Professor Jean-François Godbout and Christopher Cochrane from the University of Toronto, we started being curious about historical patterns of speech in the Canadian Parliament. So who speaks about what topics, in which circumstances, what dynamics there were in Parliament when it comes to speaking.
And what drew you towards the study of parliamentary debate and speeches and text analysis and all of that? Like what drew you towards that topic in general?
That's a good question. So my thesis, as I said, was trying to study the representation of the senior population specifically. And so I was wondering whether MPs were interested in topics and issues that are in the interest of the senior population. And because of strong party discipline in the Canadian Parliament, it's hard to use other measures such as roll call data in order to position MPs on different issues. So because of the very strong government versus opposition dynamic, it's hard to know whether two MPs from the same party or two MPs from the government have different interests in the same issue. In my case, it was issues that relate to seniors. And so I was looking for another type of data or way to measure MPs' interest in this issue. And so I turned to what they say, what they talk about in Parliament instead, thinking that I might find something interesting there.
That's a great way to segue into your article and the article we're talking about today and the methodology, if you can kind of briefly summarize both aspects.
Yes. So our paper looks at who speaks in the Canadian House of Commons, about what topics, and whether who speaks and about what are related together, and to procedures. So the main topic of our paper is procedural rules in Parliament. And we argue that these rules can influence who speaks and what they speak about. So our methods looks at every speech pronounced in the House between 1901 and 2015. We took the data from LIPAD, which is available online to anyone who would like to use it. And we analyzed the data using different methods, such as counting words, counting speeches, and then different methods in automatic text processing in order to identify topics discussed by MPs. We have different findings in the paper. So first, we find that frontbenchers, both from government and the opposition, make more speeches, so they speak more frequently in the House. But backbenchers, both from the government and opposition, tend to make longer speeches. So when they do get the chance to speak, they speak for a longer time. And we also find that government backbenchers have had more and more chances to intervene during the debates over time. So they have more opportunities to speak, but they still remain the group of MPs with the fewest speaking opportunities. We then turn to rules in order to explain some of what we found in the first part of the paper. And we find that procedural topics are present in about 20 to 30% of speeches. So a lot of the speeches revolve around procedures. And we are able to confirm that the introduction of new rules in Parliament was associated with the amount of procedural talk in the House. We also confirmed that party leaders use more procedural talk when they intervene in the debates. And so we argue that this is a form of agenda control from party leaders. And then all of that leads us to a final analysis on procedures and polarization. And so we were interested to see if procedural talk might be associated with an increasing polarization. And our analysis suggests that this might be the case. And so we think that scholars who are interested in scaling ideology from text data, especially parliamentary text data, should be careful and think about the place taken by procedural talk in their corpora, basically.
Okay, and how would specifically procedural talk influence study of polarization? Is that can you take me through that a little bit?
Yes. So what we find is that certain measures of polarization. So in our case, what we did is we scaled ideology in the corpus of Canadian parliamentary debates using a very common method called wordfish. And so this is used a lot to position parties on a scale. And then, but what wordfish does is that it estimates the position of texts on one dimension, based on the content. So the words used in the text. So the fact that it uses only one dimension can be, a bit limited in certain contexts, such as Canada, because we usually agree in Canada that there are more than one dimension when it comes to positioning parties. So we might have the left-right dimension and also a nationalist centralization dimension. And so wordfish would have trouble positioning, would not be able to position parties on these different dimensions. We used wordfish to position the Liberal and the Conservative party members using our data because it's a very common tool. And then we were able to see that if polarization between parties was larger, so in the years or in the parliaments when polarization was larger according to wordfish, it was also the years or the parliaments when there was more procedural content being discussed by MPs. And so what we argue is that the presence of the varying presence of procedural talk in text can influence how we are going to position parties ideologically in our analyses. So there are different ways to go around this. So one way of doing it would be to remove all procedural talk, but it's difficult to do so because procedural talk is not just going to make a speech only about procedure necessarily. There is going to be procedural words intertwined with other more substantive topics. And so it's difficult to go around this limitation while keeping a logical set of text data, if I can say. So it's just something that one has to take into account when they want to position parties on ideologically. And this is one of the things that we demonstrate in the paper.
And while we're in the area of speech, like software analysis, can you take me through structural topic models? That's because that was the other major method, right, within the paper? Just so that.
So structural topic modeling is an unsupervised method of text analysis. So it's a way of identifying topics within a corpus without going in the text manually and then coding manually the different topics. So what it does is, based on the co-occurrences of words in different documents, it finds a certain number of topics within the corpus. So we have to set a specific number of topics before doing the analysis. So, and there are different tests that we can do to find a good number of topics. In our case, we found that 35 topics was a pretty good numbers of topics for the corpus of Canadian parliamentary debates that we had. And so we asked the model to find the words that were most associated with these different 35 topics. And so we found different topics, such as topics that seem to relate to justice, trade, and then topics that were more or less related to forms of speech. So the words associated with these topics were more general terms related to forms of speech. And then we had a few topics that seemed to tap into procedural words. And so words that we could identify as words of procedures in Parliament. And so with this method, we were able to find or at least confirm in some way that about 20 to 30% of everything that was said in Parliament related to these procedural topics. So this was so these topics were very common basically in our corpus.
Does the fact that Canadian Parliament is split between French and English, did that affect the speech analysis at all, or having to go between two languages kind of thing?
So this is a very common problem in speech analysis, usually because if there are multiple languages, it's gonna not be able to, it's gonna probably find topics just in French and others just in English. Our corpus was all translated in English, so it wasn't a problem. But, it's a problem usually in text analysis, translation and everything.
And that translation to French, would that be an automatic translation, or is that something the Canadian government manually does? Or something like that?
That's a good question. So the data was taken from the Hansards, which are published by Parliament. So everyone can just go on the Parliament website and find the transcript of debates in the Hansards. What LIPAD does, the project that gathered all of the data, is that they collect with computers. Basically, they collect all of the answers and transform them into data that can be used in analyses such as ours, so in traditional data set format. So they go on and so for older answers that were basically really old photocopied books, they extracted the text, and then more recently, when everything moved online on the Canadian the Parliament website, they scraped, if I can say, the content of the answers in order to make it into a more usable data set. So the translation is the Parliament's translation. They have people there translating everything that's being said. So in the answer, you're always going to have one side of the page that's English and the other side of the page that's French for every debate.
Okay. And to kind of transition away from methodology, what novel aspect to speech analysis did this article kind of go into, and what, I guess, briefly, could you touch on what literature it's building upon as well? Don't have to do a full literature review or anything like that, just like a brief synopsis kind of thing.
Yeah. So the paper builds on literature in both legislative behavior, so dynamics within legislatures, between parties, between MPs. So it builds on one part on this literature, but it also builds on the literature in natural language processing, if I can say, so computational social sciences. So in order to improve the ways we use text data in our different analyses. So there has been past research looking at whether the introduction of new procedures or even changes to electoral rules influence who speaks in Parliament and about what topics and stuff like that. So some analyses in other national contexts look, for example, at whether when there was electoral changes to the electoral rules, whether MPs started to speak about local matters more, for example, because of changes to incentives, to electoral incentives. And so our paper builds upon this literature because it presents one very comprehensive analysis of who speaks about what and what's the link between procedures and all of this. I mean, it's important to note that there has been a lot of procedural changes in the Canadian Parliament since 1867. So the way who can speak when, what the schedule looks like has changed a lot in Canada. And so it was a good case for us to study whether or not there was a relationship between these changes and the content of speeches.
Could you briefly go over like the timeline of those rule changes and kind of like the broad impacts they had? Don't have to get into specifics, just like where we started from and then like where we are now in terms of maybe major errors or things like that in terms of how parliamentary debates have evolved.
Yeah. So because of, so individual members of Parliament used to have a lot more freedom when speaking in Parliament. So historically, they could intervene at almost any time during the debates. Today is very different. So these opportunities are very much controlled by party leaders. And this has happened gradually over time. So there has been different rule changes across time in order to either make it more difficult for individual MPs to block the debates by making very long speeches, or just giving more time in the debates to government in order to advance government matters. So for instance, as the size of the Canadian government increased, there was a need for things to run more smoothly in the House. And so governing parties pushed for the implementation of new rules in order to get more speaking time, leave fewer opportunities to speak to backbenchers or other individual members of the House. I'm not going to go into too many specifics about which days and everything, but there has been a lot of changes between at least 1900 and today.
And in your paper, you argue that this changes has overall hurt the opportunities for backbenchers to speak. Do you have any normative or observations based on that, and what that's done for parliamentary debates now that backbenchers play a smaller role than they used to in terms of the overall parliament?
Yes, I mean that's a good question. I think this leaves fewer opportunities for individual MPs to address issues that are important to their constituents. And this is, after all, what our system is built on. So we know that there is a practice of party leaders having submitting a list of speakers ahead of time to the Speaker of the House in order for the people that they want to be able to speak during a certain debate. There are also MPs who are going to read prepared speeches, even if it's in a time when they should be able to speak about any issues that they want. They're going to still be reading a prepared speech by their party. So I think this perhaps hurts the ability of individual MPs to bring up issues that are very relevant or important or crucial or anything to their own local constituents. And so I think it's a bit perhaps illogical in a system like ours.
And in the paper, you mentioned that Canada is a good case for this type of article or this type of methodology because it's in kind of the middle ground between the Anglo-American parliamentary model and the, or at least parliamentary culture, and then a more European or Western European model. Can you explain that a little bit more? Because I found that kind of point interesting. Just that we're kind of in the middle between two separate models.
Yeah. So that's another reason why Canada is especially interesting for these types of analyses. So why it's between the Anglo-American model and European, if I can say, model is so on the one hand, because of our electoral system, so with local representation and first past the post elections, there should be, at least in theory, strong incentives for MPs to speak about issues that are important to their local constituents. So, and this is more like the Anglo-American model of legislative organization. So, Australia, the US, the UK, which also have this stronger local representation, or at least incentives for local representation. So, and as I said before, historically, the House of Commons was left more room for that type of representation, with individual MPs being able to intervene at any time. Now that this has changed, with more control by party leaders, this has led. So there is now a different set of incentives, if I can say. So we are also close to systems where citizens are going to vote for a party, not an individual representation, in terms of incentives. So, and these are countries that fall into a party list model, like France, Germany, and the Netherlands. And so in these we would expect from theory that in these countries, parliamentary dynamics would be more controlled by parties because of the different electoral incentives, for example. And so this is why Canada is a little bit in between, and there are different reasons why this is the case. So one theory for why our parliament has adopted stricter control for floor access and even just stricter party discipline in general over votes was that different factions, so regional, linguistic, religious factions had started to emerge within parties at different moments of the history of Canada. And so the creation of new parties along these lines, so along religious lines or along linguistic lines or along regional lines, has led to an increase in party unity. And then this in turn led to the adoption of rules restricting the influence of private party members. And then the ball is just rolling. And then it's one thing leads to another, which leads to another.
And in terms of partisanship, do you think, is that more a symptom of society at large, or has the rules of parliament led parliament towards a more partisan nature? Like, what are the causal forces there, hypothetically or theoretically?
Yeah, that's also that's difficult. Also, I mean, to know which comes first, I guess it's kind of a chicken and egg problem. Just like, whether or not polarization leads to like people being less cordial in parliament, it's hard to say to know which comes first. Basically, it would be hard to intertwine these two things.
Yeah, because you do mention decline in kindness, although that could just be the way the words we used back then and the different words we use now. But is that pretty much the case, or were those words just for show back then, or has Parliament actually gotten less cordial like over time?
Yeah, research. There has been research that has confirmed that Canadian MPs have become less cordial. In our paper, we do find that we do identify a topic that we call the kindness topic, which is like words related to friend or kind words, basically. And we did find that there was a decrease in this topic over time, but this topic also includes some words that are that look like words used to refer to men also. So it might also be just because of there is a greater diversity in terms of gender now in the House, which might be associated with a decline in this specific topic that we identified from our text. But yes, I mean, there is research confirming that politicians are less cordial now than before. To know if I mean, I wouldn't say that our analysis confirms that, but this is something worth mentioning. And
I know this article is written actually, I don't know the exact date, if it's before COVID or not, but do you have any theoretical ideas about what maybe having an online parliament has done overall to the speeches over that time, or what kind of research might be interesting in that area, considering your past research?
The analysis was all done before. We finished the paper during COVID, but it was almost finished before. And we don't have any data in the paper from when Parliament was online. I think I'd be interested to know if MPs perhaps care less about what people say. Like, we've all been in Zoom meetings when it's easier to just doze off and do something else while someone is talking, which is more difficult to do when you're face to face with someone in real life. So I'd be interested to know if there's something there, if MPs are just like less caring of each other because of the divide of the screen. I think this would be an interesting, indicator that they are also being less cordial to each other, just in how they're being attentive to others.
Yeah, I thought of that question because Canadian journalist Rex Murphy, I heard him talking about it, like if the online process has led to a less human interaction and created a more easier to not vilify, maybe vilify is the right word, the other parties, the other side, because everything's online and not a face-to-face, which tends to humanize interactions a bit more. So I was just thought that might be interesting. Maybe a future research area.
I actually never thought about this, so thanks for a new research question.
Yeah, and kind of as we reach the last few questions of the podcast, like how do you see any future based on of where this type of research can go methodologically? Are there technical limitations we have right now that might improve over time, and what more avenues can we kind of go for text and speech analysis?
I think, one of the things that we mentioned in the conclusion and that we still, don't have an answer for that is, I think I'd be really interested in seeing a way, a method, an approach, a dictionary or something that allows us to extract procedural thought from corpora without like hurting what people are saying, if I can say. And this is a really difficult thing to do because where procedural thought will depend on different contexts and stuff like that. But if we were able to do so without removing just entire parts of speeches, which is something that some scholars do for lack of better alternative, just remove entire speeches that they identify as being too related to procedures. So this is a limited way of doing it. So if we had a way of just removing the procedural content without hurting what really the data is telling us in terms of substantial issues being discussed, I'd be really interested in trying it and seeing how we can better analyze parliamentary speech data, do different analyses in terms of scaling ideology and stuff like that with this type of data that is clean from any procedural talk.
Right. And during your research in this area and time writing about it, has there ever been a moment where you really wish certain government or political speech or documents was recorded the same, to the same extent parliamentary speech has, in terms of thinking about speeches made during campaign periods or things like that? Have you ever been limited by what has been transcribed, so to speak, and what would you like to be more transcribed for future text analysis research?
I haven't thought about that, but I'd be curious to look more into debates in comedies. So a lot of the work in Parliament today is done in parliamentary comedies. And this is, at least to my knowledge, this is not something that's very much studied as of today. And so I'd be interested in, so we have all of this argument about perhaps how Parliament is becoming more polarized and less cordial and everything, and people are sticking to the party line most of the time, and government backbenchers aren't given a lot of speaking time and stuff like that. But then there's this entire other story about what MPs do and what they work on and how they work together on legislative on legislation in committees of the House. And so I'd be really interested in seeing if there is another side of the story, if there is very great examples of collaboration and people being nice to each other and working together to advance different types of legislation.
Well, I think that's a great place to end off. If you want to quickly go over what you've been up to for the last 2 years, if you want to. If not, we can move on. But for as a PhD student myself, I'm always interested in where people go and what they do after they get their PhD. So.
Yes, so since defending my dissertation, I've been working actually as a research consultant, if I can call myself this, in the private sector. So I've been doing some more applied research, and this has led me to discovering a lot of different research questions that are very different from what we do at the university, but also getting to play with a lot of different data types that I hadn't had the chance to play with during my PhD. And so it has been a really great learning experience for me. And I've also been working still a little bit on academic research, presenting some work at conferences and stuff like that, still on speech analysis.
Okay, great. I think that's a great place to end off. I'm happy you're doing well, and thank you for joining us today on the CJPS podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Insights, a Canadian Journal of Political Science podcast. This was Florence Dubois discussing the topic of parliamentary debates in Canada. For future episodes, follow us on Twitter at CJPS_RCSP, or subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. If you want to support the CJPS and its podcast, we welcome any distribution of our episodes and further reading of the articles discussed within the podcast. We hope Insights by the CJPS will be a valuable resource for teaching political science and will inspire you to read the article more in-depthly. Thank you for listening.